Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation. This is a bit of a different format than I usually use, but some people have requested it, and I figured, what the heck? This is what I do, sadly enough, in my free time because I really love reading research articles and journal articles. I find them, I download them, and I try to figure out what I can pick out of them. So as we wait, we still have about another, I don't know, minute before we actually kick off. But I'm wondering what questions you might have, if you have any, about the neuroscience behind mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. I see a lot of people are joining us, and that is excellent. So I am going to try to do some sneaky stuff. So this is the article that we will be talking about. You can find it in PubMed. You just Google PubMed, PUBMED, and you can get it to come up for you if you want to actually parse the entire article yourself. It is somewhat dense, as I said in the community post, but that's okay. You know, there's nothing wrong with having a lot of information and a lot of material. I am going to bring this back down. Now, I'm not going to leave that up on the screen because I don't think most of you really want to sit there and read off the screen, but I will give you a link to it at the end of the presentation. So the article is called Mindfulness Meditation and Psychopathology. One of the things that one of the frustrations I had with this particular article is that they focus on what they call mindfulness meditation, which is like mindfulness-based stress reduction. And that's wonderful. But he also includes mindfulness based cognitive therapy, which is a little bit different. So there are a lot of different types of mindfulness out there, and we'll get to it. But this is one of the challenges that we actually face. And Brabuff, that's a really good point that you bring up, and we will talk about how it is not mysterious. It really makes a whole lot of sense when you start breaking it down. In the next hour, maybe, we'll review the current understanding of mindfulness through the lens of clinical neuroscience, outlining the core capacities targeted by mindfulness, mapping them onto cognitive and affective constructs of the research domain criteria matrix proposed by the National Institute of Mental Health. We review efficacious applications of mindfulness to specific domains of psychopathology, including depression, anxiety, chronic pain, substance use, and emerging efforts related to ADHD, traumatic stress, disordered eating, and severe and persistent mental illness. So what we are looking at is understanding how mindfulness impacts our thinking, our cognitive constructs, and our feeling, our affective constructs, and how that relates to depression, anxiety, pain, substance abuse, trauma, etc. When we're doing mindfulness, and as I mentioned, there are many different types of mindfulness. Some are very meditation based. Some are very stop in the moment, open awareness based that doesn't require as much structure. However, some of the common characteristics of the mindfulness therapies include present-centered awareness in order to sustain the focus of attention in the present moment. Go figure. So you're focusing on what is going on right now. And as I've said in a lot of my other videos, at this context and at this time, am I safe? What are the facts for and against my beliefs? in this context at this time. Present-centered awareness is in contrast to becoming caught up in a chain of thoughts about the past or even the future. So your regrets, your guilt, your whatever, your disappointments, or your anxieties. And the past we can't change. The future we can't predict. Present-centered awareness is often facilitated by attending to sensory perceptions and bodily sensations. Not everybody can attend to sensory perceptions and bodily sensations, at least not right away, especially if they are trauma survivors, abuse survivors. That may not be the best way to go, but there are a lot of grounding activities that can help bring people back to the moment, such as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 things you see, 4 things you hear, 3 things you smell, 2 things you can feel, and 1 thing you can taste. The goal of the present focus is to figure out how to take your brain, which may be going 6 ways to Sunday, and bring it back to what's going on right now. Another concept that is common to mindfulness and mindfulness meditation is non-reactivity to experience. Accepting what's going on non-judgmentally. And depending on the theory that you're using, ACT, DBT, mindfulness-based stress reduction, there's slightly different words: radical acceptance, non-judgmental acceptance. But ultimately, mindfulness means accepting what's going on and suspending our habitual way of reacting. If you typically would fly off the handle at somebody, or you typically would become terrified and withdraw, mindfulness is encouraging you to stop before you act. Stop and become curious, accepting, and non-judgmental. In dialectical behavior therapy, Linehan talks a lot about describing, and that's when the person is actually observing what is going on in this context at this time, and maybe how is this different from the past or similar to the past, as the case may be. And that is another important aspect, because when we are reactive, when we experience something and we are on autopilot and we react, what it does is it strengthens those neural connections between whatever's going on and the response: fear, anger, whatever it is. And we don't want to strengthen that pathway necessarily. Becoming mindfully aware of what's going on around you, the present moment, and suspending your reactions for a moment in order to evaluate the accuracy and effectiveness of your habitual beliefs and reactions in the current context helps people start forming new pathways. So they're going along, something happens. Normally they turn right. This time they stop and say, do I want to turn right? Is that going to help me move toward my rich and meaningful life? Excuse me. Is it necessary to turn right? Or can I turn left? And they start getting curious about, why might I want to turn right versus left? And what are the benefits of turning left? Deification refers to a shift in the practitioner's relationship with thoughts, such that thoughts are no longer experienced as reified or real objects in the world. Hayes talks a lot about this in acceptance and commitment therapy. Instead of saying, I am a failure, saying, I'm having the thought that I'm a failure. And we've talked about this in other videos. When you make that slight semantic change, you're saying, I don't know what I am. I'm having the thought that this is going on. Do I accept it? Do I accept that thought and turn right? Or do I reject that thought and turn left? So once you have a thought, then it starts feeling more controllable. It starts feeling less about you and more about something that you have. The capacity to sustain present-centered awareness is facilitated by the moment-by-moment focus on a meditation object. In some instances, obviously, when you're doing mindfulness-based meditation, you're focusing on a sound, you're focusing on a candle flame, you're focusing on something. But you can't have open awareness meditation where you are, or open awareness mindfulness, where you're just soaking it in. You're paying attention to what's going on around you without getting hooked on any one particular thing. It's like, oh, there's a squirrel. Oh, look at the cloud. And you're becoming aware and staying focused in the present moment because there's so much to be aware of. And by encouraging your brain to do that, you start learning how to have better control over your thoughts. Think about a young child who is, at a museum. Oh my gosh, my son used to go crazy at museums, and he would be all over the place. And it was important for me to bring him back and go, okay, we're going to focus on this right now, and then we'll go over there if we need to. As I mentioned, a lack of definitional consensus complicates the straightforward use of a singular mindfulness construct. Mindfulness, as used in practice and cognitive behavioral therapy, can mean being aware of the facts and context in the current moment, and it has nothing to do with meditation. Then you have mindfulness meditation over here, where you're actually training your brain to focus on something, or in some cases, clear all thoughts from it. And that can be more difficult. So, however, all of the practices of mindfulness encourage the person to do that present focus. And ultimately, that is the core feature, if you will, that focus on facts in the present context, the non-judgmental acceptance, and the de-reification, where, it's not something that is part of me. It is a thought that I'm having. Those three things are common in all mindfulness practices, and that is where the magic lies. Acceptance and commitment therapy incorporates principles of mindfulness practice into a broader model based on behavior theory that emphasizes the role of linguistic framing in psychological problems in order to increase psychological flexibility. And that's what I was talking about with unhooking. When in acceptance commitment therapy, one of the things you do is, instead of saying, I am weak, I am afraid, I am this, I'm having the feeling that, I'm having the thought that. Okay, we all have thoughts, we all have feelings, and they may change at the drop of a hat. But once you know you have it, and it's something that that's malleable, then it gives you a different perspective instead of feeling controlled by it because it's thinking it's part of you. In dialectical behavior therapy, principles of mindfulness form a common thread supporting the development of capacities for emotion regulation, distress tolerance, and interpersonal effectiveness. Well, let's think about how that might work. A lot of people who experience emotional dysregulation are reacting based on the schema that were formed from prior experiences. And when they react that way in the present, it strengthens that pathway. So being aware of the present moment and unhooking from it, recognizing this may not be going on right now as I'm interpreting it, that is huge for emotional regulation. It's huge for helping people recognize, okay, I feel scared right now. I have this feeling. Is it necessary? Based on the facts in context, is it necessary? And they're able to learn how to pause between being triggered and reacting. Distress tolerance is another aspect of mindfulness in the present moment. And Linehan talks about the difference between distress tolerant and distress intolerant thoughts. And you can have distress intolerant thoughts. I can't take this. This is too much for me to handle. Okay, well, you're telling yourself you're going to fail. Distress tolerant thoughts are more like, this is really freaking unpleasant right now, and I've gotten through worse. This too shall pass. I can get through this even though it sucks. So distress tolerance, again, encourages you not to ignore what's going on, but to use that present focus, use the focus in the present moment to understand what's going on in the current context. That includes your ability to tolerate distress. It encourages you to unhook from those feelings. I feel overwhelmed right now. Do I have to stay overwhelmed? What am I going to do with this overwhelmedness, if you will? And it encourages you to get curious about, how can I survive this? Or how can I get through this distress that is really unpleasant? And what have you. Psychopathology, and I hate that word. When we're talking about psychopathology, we're really talking about anxiety, depression, PTSD, ADHD, some other things, where people are experiencing emotional or cognitive distress. I don't like the word pathology because it pathologizes something that's often a normal reaction to an abnormal experience, but I digress. A lot of these issues in the DSM-5 TR, our diagnostic manual, are widely understood to originate in the dysregulation of underlying cognitive and emotional systems. Well, duh. People who experience depression, for example, in the present moment, they're feeling hopeless and helpless. Well, what beliefs are contributing to that feeling? And how did those beliefs develop? They didn't just come out of nowhere. They developed based on experiences. And by becoming mindful, the person can differentiate the past from the present. The person can recognize their power in the present moment and respond to those feelings. Feelings are natural. Feelings are a normal reaction. Again, in other videos, feelings are like a smoke alarm. When you feel anxious, when you feel angry, those are flee or fight responses to a perceived stress. Just like the smoke alarm goes off when it perceives there might be a fire, doesn't mean there's a fire, but it's going off and it wants you to get up and do what you need to do to get safe. Same thing for your stress response. You feel this, your brain's saying, okay, based on prior experiences, this could be really crappy. However, it doesn't pay attention as much to what's going on right now. It says, my expectations are, okay, well, thanks for the info. Now, let's look at the facts in the current context. So mindfulness is really based both affectively and cognitively. You can't examine the facts in context until you acknowledge the emotion. If you don't know when you're feeling something, then you can't respond to it. A central aspect of mindfulness in particular is responding to attentional capture by distracting thought processes. And that is another important aspect. A lot of people who struggle with emotional dysregulation and mental health issues, mood issues, also struggle with monkey mind. They may be trying to focus on something and then they start wondering if they're being judged. They start thinking about something they regret. They start thinking about somebody they resent. Their mind is just all over the place, and it can be triggered by a lot of different things. So mindfulness is becoming aware. If you're doing your homework, when your mind starts to wander, you bring it back to your homework. That's it. You say, no, not going to think about that right now. Come back here. For some of my clients, I find it's easier for them when their mind starts to wander if they write it down and then they put it over to the side. I'll deal with that later. And that kind of gives their brain permission to let that go. But they're not dwelling on it. They're not allowing their brain to go whatever direction it wants to go. They are starting to take control of that. Functional connectivity between the subnetworks of the default mode, or autopilot, appears to increase with mindfulness practice, while connectivity between major default mode or autopilot hubs appears to decrease. What we're doing is we're retraining the autopilot. That's what we're doing. If I grew up in an environment that was chaotic and traumatic and felt dangerous to me, and up until now, whenever I'd been in a situation that was similar to that, it reminded me of my family of origin, and I became really stressed out and anxious and started freaking out. Strengthen that connection. Okay, that makes sense. That's the brain going, yeah, we probably don't want to do this again. What we're doing with mindfulness by making ourselves become aware of our feeling, explore our thoughts and the facts for and against them in context, we're creating new connections. So we're reprogramming that default to say, yes, in the past, situations like this were unsafe. However, now I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I'm older, I'm wiser, I've got more tools, whatever, and I got this. Doesn't mean we're going to forget the past, but it's adding to it. It's modifying that programming to say, that's not true all the time anymore. Reduced default mode network activation, reduced autopilot, during meditation style practice, as well as increased resting state functional connectivity between regions of the DMN and CEN during rest, just give me a minute, are consistent with greater capacity to self-regulate, self-referential discursive thinking. Ugh. In English, please. So, as we reduce default mode network hyperactivation, there's increased resting state functional connection, which is good. Functional, that's what we want. We don't want dysfunctional. So the default mode, the autopilot, is starting to form new connections. Now, the DMN is our autopilot, and the CEN is the central executive network. That's our prefrontal cortex, our higher order thinking. So we see increased resting state connectivity between the default mode and the wise mind. Hallelujah! So now we start learning and we start creating pathways so we are reacting not only based upon feelings, but also we're able to engage that higher order thinking and decide what's going on. When we start being able to do this, then we start having a greater ability to regulate how we're feeling and whether we are in danger or whether we are, fill in the blank. The possibility that mindfulness protects against degradation of cognitive abilities due to stress, as observed in pre-deployment military personnel, also deserves further investigation. They didn't really go into this very much in the article, but let's hypothesize. We've got time. Mindfulness, if people learn to use it before deployment, how might that help them buffer against the HPA axis hyperactivation and potentially dysregulation in battle events when they're deployed. Well, guess what? They're learning how to acknowledge a situation for what it is. Some of the situations they're going to encounter are horrific. I'm not denying that. Some of the situations are extremely dangerous. I'm not denying that. But if they develop the skills to stop between being triggered and reacting, then they're also able to maintain the connections with their higher order thinking, their prefrontal cortex, and say, in this context, at this time, I am safer. They're not telling themselves constantly, I'm in danger, I'm in danger, I'm in danger. That's a feeling. They feel like they're in danger. What are the facts in the current context? And that actually probably reduces the adrenaline and glutamate load in their brain while the entire time they're deployed. In paradigms that combine spontaneous and timed probes of participants' mental focus, so researchers went in there every 20 minutes for the timed probes and just randomly for the spontaneous ones. But in paradigms that combine those, on participants' mental focus on relevant task versus task unrelated thought, mindfulness training was associated with both reduced mind wandering and increased meta-awareness of distraction. What does that mean? Well, we kind of talked about that a minute ago. When people start, thank you, Jeremy, that is super helpful. When we start noticing, remember I used the example of homework before. When we start noticing when our mind starts to wander, we don't get mad about it because that's just going to kick off a whole nother cascade of things. We notice it. We get curious. We're like, really? Why are you wandering off? And I like to think of it, I've done fostering and animal rescue for, the better part of my life. And I typically specialize in orphan kittens. So I'll have a whole litter of orphan kittens and they just wander off. They're curious. They wander off. And I think of my thoughts like those kittens. And I'm like, nope. Come back here. We're not going to do that right now. But you can use whatever metaphor that works for you. But ultimately, it says that as we practice, your mind will wander less and you're going to become more aware of when your mind starts to wander so you can bring it back in. Cool beans. Developing the capacity to detect and disengage from attentional capture by future or past orienting thinking holds a special theoretical relevance. So developing the ability to recognize triggers and disengage from them, recognize that, okay, this reminds me of something from the past, or this is triggering my fear about something that's going to happen in the future. Recognizing that is great because then you can address it. Once you recognize the problem, you can take steps towards it. Task unrelated thought, neurally subserved by the autopilot default mode network, is known to be biased toward negative affect and self-relevant content. Other videos, we've talked about how our brain pays more attention to the vipers than the bunny rabbits. That's a survival mechanism. So our default mode is to be scanning for threats. Our default mode is not to be scanning for bunny rabbits and sunflowers. So understanding that's just how your brain's wired to help you survive can be a little bit, it can be a little bit of an aha moment. I'm not sure what word I'm looking for here, but it's also important to understand that you can train your brain to become more aware of the entire picture, not just scanning for the negative, but also recognizing the positive, the dialectics, the good and the bad. There's this crappy stuff going on over here, and there's this other stuff that's going well. The inability to disengage from maladaptive thinking patterns leads to repetitive negative thinking, which contributes to depression, anxiety, addictive craving, pain-related distress, among other things. Well, duh. If you notice that there's a threat and you're constantly noticing that there's threats around, what's your mood going to be like? What are you going to feel like? We're not necessarily basing it in fact because we may not be getting the full picture. And mindfulness helps us get that full picture that we really need in order to make judgments. But each time you notice something negative, it reinforces your belief that you are in danger, you are hopeless, you are helpless, and to the exclusion of noting all the things that are there to support you, to support your recovery. In terms of valence-related processes, now valence is the importance or the characteristics of your feelings. Mindfulness may modulate valence systems through enhanced emotional awareness, altered emotional reactivity, promotion of cognitive reappraisal. So instead of being instantly reactive and dysregulated, the person becomes aware of their emotions, they stop, they cognitively assess and appraise the situation, and hopefully have a positive experience, which leads to ultra reward processing. They're like, oh, in this situation, I don't have to jump down your throat in order to stay safe. I can actually communicate assertively. How about that? Notably, in a recent meta-analysis, it's not real recent now, 2014, mindfulness practice was consistently associated with changes in the structure and function of regions integral to emotional appraisal and regulation, including the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, fear processing, higher order thinking, and the hippocampus, emotion processing. So mindfulness practice actually starts changing the wiring between those areas in order to facilitate more mindful, if you will, purposeful action. Through cultivating meta-awareness of mental processes by becoming aware of your thoughts and contents and maintaining present-focused attention, mindfulness may improve the ability to detect and recognize emotional states, thus allowing for their regulation through conscious, executive, or wise mind control. And what I think you're hearing, I hope you're hearing at this point, is the same thing kind of being restated multiple times. Present focus and de-reification, not having it be part of you, and curiosity, our non-judgmental curiosity, are so important because when you go into a situation and you know it's going to be bad, how's that going to prime your body and prime your brain? Cultivation of non-reactivity. Now, that doesn't mean sitting back and going, okay, whatever, I'm your doormat. It means putting that space between when you feel something and when you act on it. Putting that space in there so you can decide, you're at the fork in the road. Are you going to go right? Are you going to go left? And again, recognizing that feeling, that's automatic. You don't really have any choice over that. Recognizing the feeling and not reacting to it is important. And reacting, think of the prefix re, to do it again. So are you going to do what you've always done, or are you going to choose a different action? But cultivating non-reactivity so you can get into your wise mind, and de-reification, separating it, going, okay, I'm having this thought, I'm having this feeling, what do I do with it? It is thought to be crucial in that emotional reactivity or altering that. Cognitive reappraisal involves adopting an altered mental interpretation of a situation or stimulus to promote a more adaptive emotional response. Cognitive reappraisal is saying, in this situation, in this context, at this time, what are the facts for and against my beliefs, and what is the best choice, what is the best behavioral response, if you will, to help me use my energy to move toward my rich and meaningful life. And cognitive reappraisal is something we do a lot in therapy, helping people look at something with fresh eyes, as I say. Stepping back, and if your parent abandoned you, and as a child you took that personally, you thought you weren't good enough, you weren't lovable, whatever. As an adult, looking back at it with fresh eyes and going, what are the facts that you know now, and what are your beliefs? It's not for me to tell you how to appraise a situation, but encouraging people to become more mindful and engage in that reappraisal can be helpful. Mindfulness practitioners have shown altered neural activity relative to non-meditators during reward anticipation. Now, this is really interesting, and in my mind, because one of the things we see in pornography addiction is it's not the orgasm the person experiences that provides the dopamine rush. It's the anticipation of the reward that is actually what is promoting the addictive behaviors. So I think that's interesting, and I'd like to see how that plays out in terms of other addictions, chemical addictions. I believe it's very similar with gambling, which is attention and release behavior, if you will. But it's not so much the release, it's the tension building that is enthralling and exciting and dopamine stimulating. But mindfulness practitioners are able to tamp that down a little bit. And you may be going, well, why would you want to tamp that down? It can, think about Christmas time when you were little, or Hanukkah, whatever, and you knew you were going to be getting presents. Oh my gosh, I don't think I slept most Christmas nights waiting for Santa to come and Christmas morning and everything. I was wired. And that disrupts your sleep. It disrupts your circadian rhythms. It may make you more irritable because you want it and you want it now, or maybe even you want it yesterday. So by learning how to tolerate anticipation, especially reward anticipation, it can actually help with emotional regulation. Now, let's briefly talk about psychopathology. Hate that word. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy has been shown to reduce the risk of depressive relapse for patients with recurrent depression at a 60-week, that's a 5-year follow-up. Wow. So that is pretty significant. Mindfulness training is designed to help practitioners, the clients, exit depressive rumination by returning attention to the present moment, with de-reification also reducing emotional salience of ruminative thought processes. So what they're saying is, for people who tend to be depressed, they get caught in this rumination cycle of feeling hopeless and helpless and unloved and guilty, and they're thinking about all their failures and not focusing on any of the other stuff. And mindfulness encourages them to learn how to take a more balanced view and unhook from those thoughts and be able to observe them, be able to analyze them for their accuracy. And it can also help them become more aware when they start going into a ruminative cycle, so they can get out of it, if you will. Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy has also been found to reduce overly generalized autobiographical memory. I failed at this one thing, therefore I am a failure. Okay. I am having the thought that I failed at this one thing. Therefore, I am a failure. So you're de-reificating it. You're unhooking from it. And you're looking at it to say, is this really about me? Or is this about a situation? Neurally, this account is supported by findings of mindfulness-related decreases in autopilot activation and increases in the connection between the autopilot and the prefrontal cortex. So decreasing between just random default without thinking about it, and increasing, okay, when the default goes into play, we're also going to bring the thinking mind online too. With regard to anxiety, there's significantly less research evaluating mindfulness for anxiety relative to depression, which really surprised me because you still have the ruminative thoughts, you still have the emotional dysregulation. So I was surprised that there was not more research. Hodge et al. Randomly assigned 89 participants to either mindfulness-based stress reduction or psychoeducation. Both groups showed comparable reductions in clinician-rated anxiety. However, relatively larger reductions were found in the mindfulness condition on measures of global severity, self-reported anxiety, and stress reactivity. So the people who learned about anxiety got some insight. They started developing some tools to deal with it, but the mindfulness really encouraged them to engage in a lifestyle practice where they were noticing how they were feeling, stopping, and addressing it right then. Facilitation by mindfulness training of top-down regulation of reactivity, so wise mind oriented instead of emotional. Facilitation of mindfulness by top-down regulation of reactivity to ambiguous stimuli is consistent with observed correlation between increased prefrontal cortex and amygdala connectivity and reduced symptoms. So what they're saying is once we start being able to operate not from an emotion-driven standpoint, but from a cognitive driven, from executive functioning, higher order thinking, whatever you want to call it, place where our wise mind is talking to our amygdala, where we do a lot of our fear processing, and they're hashing it out. People tend to have reduced symptoms, especially in terms of generalized anxiety and in response to ambiguous stimuli, because they're thinking, they're saying, hey, I don't even know what's going to happen here. It's ambiguous. So I don't have a particular response right now. In terms of pain, mindfulness-based interventions have shown significant benefits for quality of life and more limited evidence for reductions in pain across multiple pain-related syndromes, including fibromyalgia, migraine, and chronic pelvic pain. Well, let's look at a couple of things here. When we are in pain, or we expect to be in pain, we typically tense up, and that typically makes the pain worse. Additionally, when people are in pain and they start feeling depressed or anxious or angry because they're in pain, that typically, when it's over a long threshold, reduces their pain threshold. And there's a lot more neuroscience-y stuff behind that. But by using mindfulness-based interventions, people can become more aware. They wake up in the morning and they're like, oh, I hurt today. Okay. Mindfulness would say, this is how I am feeling right now. I'm having this feeling. What do I do about it? It doesn't mean that the rest of the day is going to get worse. It could, but we don't know that. That's ambiguous. What's going on in the present moment? What do I need to do in the present moment to address this issue? Mindfulness practice appears to have neural and behavioral effects on pain processing distinct from opioids, placebo, expectancy, or sham interventions. After brief mindfulness training, reductions in perceived pain intensity and unpleasantness have been associated with activation in appraisal circuitry. So the brain begins to create that pathway that says, yeah, this is unpleasant and I can tolerate it, instead of, oh, I've got this pain. Oh, it's getting worse. It's getting a lot worse. Present moment awareness may also contribute to the inhibition of aversive anticipatory cognition. When you're aware of what's going on in the present moment, then you are less likely to anticipate, to start thinking about bad things are fixing to happen. Experienced mindfulness practitioners exhibit reduced activity in the amygdala, fear processing area, and salience network regions between cue and onset of painful stimuli. So instead of the brain saying, this is going to be bad, this is going to be bad, this is going to be bad, really fast and just really noisy, people who practice mindfulness are able to kind of silence that and go, I don't know what's going to happen. I recognize I'm getting a shot, and I may get a shot, but I don't know if it's going to hurt. I had one doctor who was very talented, I guess. I don't know much about giving shots, but up until then, most of the doctors that I had ever worked with, shots were really painful. And I expected when she gave me a shot, it was going to hurt like heck. And she did it, and it didn't. And I was astounded. So that made me address it and change my beliefs about shots are always painful. Wasn't necessarily. In terms of substance use, evidence for mindfulness for substance use disorders is promising. Treatments were superior to control conditions, go figure, doing something's better than doing nothing, in reducing use-related problems and craving. In a trial conducted by Bowen et al., comparing mindfulness to relapse prevention in 286 participants with addictions, mindfulness-based interventions showed fewer days of substance use compared to both relapse prevention and therapy alone. Proposed mechanisms underlying the effectiveness of mindfulness for substance use disorders include response inhibition and extinction. When I have a craving, I don't have to respond. I start to learn I can get through this. Yeah, it's going to suck for a minute while I have that craving and it peaks and I ride that wave, but I can get through it. And then the cravings become less rewarding, or your belief about engaging the behavior becomes less rewarding, especially as the brain heals as you start getting through pause and all of your neural networks start to heal from the addictive processes. Mindfulness-related reductions in smoking have been associated with lower amygdala and insulin activation in response to stress cues. So people who smoke, when they get stressed, I know my mother did, when she would get stressed, the first thing she would do is reach for a cigarette. And what this says is in mindfulness, and people who practice mindfulness, they can be exposed to a stress cue and they are less triggered by it because they feel more empowered, I'm guessing, and they're able to put that space between feeling and acting in order to choose their behavior. Meditation increases top-down regulation, reducing automatic or autopilot behaviors associated with substance use. One potential mechanism of action for mindfulness for ADHD may be improved meta-awareness, leading to a reduction in attentional capture by task unrelated thoughts. That's what we've said before about the homework. Encouraging people who have ADD or ADHD, when they're working on a project, to become more aware when their mind starts to drift off, bringing it back in. Just bring those kittens back into line, ducks in a row, whatever you want to call it. Mindfulness is not going to cure ADHD, but it can help people become more aware. It can also help them become more aware of, hey, I'm in an environment right now that is really distracting. Mindfulness takes the focus on the present moment and encourages people to get curious and say, why is my mind wandering right now? In terms of PTSD, PTSD and related syndromes are characterized by hyperactivation and context insensitivity of negative affective systems. That means when people get triggered, when there's something that reminds them of the trauma, regardless of the current context, they get triggered and triggered in a big way sometimes. And that's what we're talking about pretty much with all of the anxiety, the depression, is helping people become more aware of the present context, become more aware of what's going on right now. Yes, the past, it was awful. Could it happen again? Maybe, who knows? But in this context right now, how am I doing? Because tolerability, adherence, and retention are challenges in trauma-focused treatment, adapting mindfulness-based interventions to PTSD requires paying particular attention to particular areas. That's what I mentioned earlier. For people who have had trauma, paying attention to bodily sensations can be triggering. For people who've had trauma, trying to quiet their mind, maybe when some of those worst memories jump out. We need to be sensitive. Mindfulness is not something, especially mindfulness-based meditation, is not something that is universally applicable with no problems. Neuroimaging of military veterans participating in a mindfulness-based exposure therapy protocol found that mindfulness practice was associated with increased activation of the prefrontal cortex. So knowing mindfulness tools, they were able to acknowledge their feelings and acknowledge their wise mind. The possibility that mindfulness may be safe and efficacious for treating serious mental illness, including psychotic and bipolar disorders, has only been proposed. And there may be some very good uses for this. For example, being aware, somebody who has bipolar disorder, becoming aware of the early warning signs of an episode can be really helpful. Becoming aware of their triggers and their vulnerabilities can be really helpful. When they are in a full-out manic episode, for example, they're expecting them to be able to activate their prefrontal cortex and downregulate. That's not realistic. Let's not set things up that are unrealistic. But mindfulness encourages them to look at the present context. When you're working with somebody who has schizophrenia, for example, there was a perfect, sorry, y'all, I'm losing my voice. There was a beautiful example on a show I was watching the other night, The Equalizer, and the person, one person started having a psychotic break and believed that they were being just covered by snakes. And the other person, instead of trying to convince them, there's not a snake here, they helped them take the snakes off. It was, what can we do to help this person feel safe in this context? In that person's reality, there were snakes. So arguing with them wasn't going to get you anywhere. Helping them in the present moment recognize, okay, I believe I have these snakes on me. What can I do to get safe? Hey, take them off. that is helpful. And I've had some experience doing similar things with people who have schizophrenia in clinical practice. It's been a while, but it can be very helpful when even if they're in a psychotic episode, they want to feel safe. So saying, okay, well, this is what you believe right now. What can you do to feel safe, to protect yourself, given that this is your reality? Few studies have examined the process or impact of implementing mindfulness in actual clinical practice, either through efficacy trials in community clinics, effectiveness studies, or explicit implementation. All of these studies that we've looked at so far have been lab studies. I mean, yeah, they used humans, but it wasn't using your random counselor on the street who's had training in mindfulness to see how effective the intervention was. Additionally, most clinicians are going to resist pure implementation of mindfulness. It's going to be an aspect of treatment, but most clinicians have other tools and things that they use. One implementation challenge highlighted by Crane and Kayukin is the training of mindfulness teachers. While routes to certification exist for mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and mindfulness-based stress reduction, the associated times and final costs will likely be infeasible for most clinicians delivering mindfulness-based interventions. So we need to find out how to make it more accessible. Ultimately, just to kind of summarize, tools that we use in practice to help people turn off that autopilot and take advantage of that space between feeling and reacting are going to be helpful at creating new pathways and strengthening them, thereby weakening the other pathways. All righty, let me look at some of your questions. Yes, in mindfulness, we start becoming aware of our options instead of doing what we've always done, which is beautiful. I'm glad I've been able to be of service to you, Nathan. And you are quite welcome, Rebecca. I am glad that you're here, and I'm glad that you all joined me today. Wow, there's 50 people. I did not expect that many people to come for an article review. If you like this video, please feel free to comment or whatever, or I'll do it by likes and thumbs up as well. It appears that I'll probably try doing this at least once more. So you can also drop suggestions for different articles you want. Before I lose you all, I do have Neuroscience of Motivation, Neuroscience of Sleep, Neuroscience of Anhedonia, and one that I know people are going to like, even though it's not my favorite topic, the Neuroscience of Narcissism. So potentially I have at least 5 more articles that I could go through. Oops. Sorry, I minimized you guys. Hang on, let me find you. There we go. And so if you enjoy this kind of format, then yeah, I'm happy to do it again. If we're getting this kind of reception, I am good. Yes, the neuroscience of motivation is astounding. Okay, everybody, have a great rest of your day. I'm probably not going to do any more of these impromptu lives before the next year, since we're coming up on the holiday season. So everybody have a safe and wonderful holiday and rest of your year, and I will see you on the flip side. Oops. Chandra, the magazine, it's actually PubMed. In the community section of my channel, I put a link to this video, or I'm sorry, to this article, but the website itself is all right. So on that note, everybody have a great day.